All right, this is Jack Donovan. You are listening to or watching PH2T3R, the Journal for Solar Culture. And I'm here with my co-host, as always, CB Robertson. And we have a new intro, I hope you saw, done by, the music for it was done by Frederick and Montana, members of the First Men. And then I sat and edited it down all together because I wanted something kind of funky and had that kind of like, I don't know, 60s, I don't know, cult vibe to it. So I'm pretty psyched about that. But today we're going to take a break from our normal, our progress that we're making through the Odyssey, doing read-throughs of the Odyssey. And we're going to talk about the woke right. And I just thought it would be a relevant discussion for us to have because of both of our backgrounds. And it just kind of dovetails into everything that just happened politically. Because we're all pretty excited about what happened in politics. We think there's, everybody's very hopeful and very positive. And I feel like solar idealism was really a little bit ahead of the game in shifting from kind of this doom mentality and we're living in a fallen age, Kali Yuga mentality, to go into, a more positive direction and a direction of creation. And I really started that, and this will all work into it. I really started talking about that in my book, A More Complete Beast, when I started talking about resentment and the problem of resentment and what it does to men, and that the answer to that is creation.
Now, is there any resentment in the woke right, Jack?
I do believe there is, but we'll get to that in a minute. So anyway, I had James Lindsay on mute. We're really big fans. So we're going to talk about the woke right. And this is something that's being used by James Lindsay. And I'm not saying that we're using it. We're going to talk about the name woke right and what it means. And James Lindsay, first we want to say we're big fans. These guys, probably a year or two ago in the Order Fire's First Men, these guys turned me on to James Lindsay and the idea of gnostic Marxism, and we've kind of incorporated that into our thing. And at first I was very resistant to it. I was like, gnostic? That's like, like this kind of weird feminine Christianity that that Jung was into and all that. I didn't associate with Marxism, and I was like, I don't know if you're mixing up things. But he sold me. I watched the videos, and James Lindsay sold me on Marxism being, or the woke being a religion, like a religious movement. And it really, really is. I mean, when you actually saw it, last time I was in Portland, I literally saw a parade of people carrying like signs. Like it was a parade. It was not a protest. It was a parade. Like it was like a passion play of like BLM and all this stuff, and it really became a religious movement. And so now James Lindsay he made a video, and we linked it in the show notes here, so I hope people watched it beforehand, where he made a video explaining what he's calling the woke right, because obviously that's the woke left. And so we watched the video a couple times, and I wanted to just go through some of the things that he introduced there. And I thought it would be interesting for us to talk about because, well, he locates the woke right as being a descendant of the alt-right. And I've been thinking about this all day. I had to look up where the meme comes from, and I was like, James Lindsay, do not cite the old lore to me. I was there when it was written. I was literally one of the when Richard Spencer started the website alternativeright.com. I was writing for it within the first year. I was on the and so I have a pretty good idea of the lay of the land where it comes to what would be called the alt-right. Now, am I alt-right? I don't think alt-right is a thing. He's calling it woke right now. I left that behind a long time ago. And I've pretty much always been the same. Actually, I was just associated with the alt-right. I'm probably closer to James Lindsay than a lot of people would expect. I mean, I probably fall more into the classical liberal tradition and the idea of like, hey, we should have free speech and get the fuck off my lawn. It is much more where I'm at than like, we should have, people marching down the street telling us what to do, whether they're communists or fascists. I don't want either of those things. So, I guess let's get into some of the people he's identified as being woke right, and then there is a part where I think he's right, but we'll get to that a little bit later.
Yeah.
He's identified first. He named Tucker Carlson, which I think is very unfair. It's not unfair in that Tucker Carlson is adjacent to the woke right, and I guess we should give him a little background. Do you? Because I'm going to talk. I'm probably going to talk a lot here in a second. Do you want to give them a little lay of the land as far as what he means, as far as like the gnostic part of?
Sure.
Because that's what woke. That's what he means by woke. So
Yeah,
let's just go with
woke.
that.
The woke implies that you are waking up from a dream reality that is an illusion. And I mean, and when he talks about Marxism being a gnostic religion, he's borrowing from the research of Vogelin, who really laid this out back in the 20th century. And he's discovered this and applied it to a lot of the stuff that wasn't around in Vogelin's time, like queer studies is even more explicit and in many ways even more theological than what we would call like orthodox Marxism, which was more disguised as economic theory. And with queer, it's much more out in the open. So anyways, he's been connecting a lot of dots, and a lot of his work is literally just reading through things. Like he'll read through a text by Lenin. He'll read through, Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts in 1848 or whatever. But the idea of woke is that you have woken up from Plato's cave. You've woken up from the illusion that you were sold as reality. And for the Gnostics in the classical kind of crypto quasi-Christian tradition, that was reality itself is an illusion. The physical world is an illusion. Your bodies are an illusion. You are in reality beings of pure spirit. For Marx, we are actually material, and ideologies are part of the illusion, and all these kinds of oppressions create a sort of Stockholm syndrome, an illusory wall of interests that are all ideologies, and you need to break free of these identities and ideologies so that you can create yourself. And there's a clear theological through line there, especially with Marx's early writings. So what he's saying with the woke right, which he opens his video by saying, I'm not sure if this is the right term for it. There's a lot to be said about naming these groups, and maybe this is the right term, maybe this is the wrong term. I'm advancing this very tepidly, very tentatively. What he's trying to say is that the thing that unifies this woke right, which is a descendant of the alt-right, is this sense that the world is controlled by powerful interests that have sold the public false stories about everything. It's in many ways, and he points this out later, very postmodern in its presentation. And that I think he's correct about. There is a postmodern satirical jokester kind of quality to it. They don't even seem themselves sure of when they're being serious or not.
Yeah, it's really frustrating with dealing with a lot of these guys. I'm like, do you know what you're posting, and you know what it means, and why? Because I do.
Yeah, and for all the talk that they make about the propaganda of the establishment and so forth, which is true, they do a pretty darn good job of gaslighting themselves. They will be intentionally insufferable, intentionally provocative, and then when people respond to them with disdain and just like, I don't want to have anything to do with you, you're an asshole, they're like, oh, you don't even have an argument. It's like, that, yeah, because you weren't making an argument back in
you're just posting black suns and swastikas like this.
Yeah. Well, so back in 2014, back in 2015, sometime around that era, there was I forget the guy's name, the guy who was in charge of an actual Nazi blog called the Daily Stormer, but he reposted but he reposted a blog post by a gray hat hacker by the name of Andrew Arenheimer. He went by the name Weave,
Okay.
And he was a very interesting character. Spent some time in prison for crypto related crimes, but probably unfairly. But he was associated with the Nazi subcomponent of the alt-right. And when we say Nazi, we're not talking about Nazi in the
Andrew
sense.
Anglin.
Yes, Andrew Anglin. There we go. So there's Andrew
Yes.
Anglin, and then there's Arenheimer. Was it also Andrew? I don't remember. But he went by Weave, was his hacker name.
Mhm.
And he wrote this piece called, and when we say Nazi, we don't mean like TradCon. We mean like, no, reads Mein Kampf and thinks it's a great idea kind
Yes.
of thing. Yeah,
Yes.
like you all these college leftists who think they're seeing Nazis everywhere, you ain't seen nothing.
Yeah. They're actual Nazis. Yeah,
Yeah.
like,
So-
I mean, they have no power, no money, but they're actual Nazis in the world.
Yeah,
Yes.
like if you ask them, "Are you a Nazi?" they will say, "Yes, I am."
Yes.
Unironically.
National Socialists is what they will say. Yeah, like Nat Sock.
in that category, and he wrote this piece called "I Sing a Song of Race War," which got reposted to a few places. And what he was race was an acronym for he had done a bunch of A/B testing, and this is how he was going to persuade everybody. R stood for remind. So like bring pictures of the opera, bring pictures of grand European architecture, the great culture of our past. Remind them. Then A stood for antagonize. So drop a hard N word, or like if only these, something intentionally provocative and antagonistic. And then if you get a sort of response out of your antagonism, C stood for condescend. And so, you're one of those people who just thinks in terms of what the media tells you or whatever. You talk down to the person that you're trying to persuade. And then E, I forget what E stood for, but it was an E word synonym for demonstrate or show. And then it's at that point that you would point them to crime statistics or the Robert Putnam Bowling Alone, or whatever piece you want to do to point to the problem in that way. And what this is very intentional psychological manipulation and brainwashing. And the irony is,
it sounds
not
smart.
Different.
I mean,
it is very smart. And I when I first read that, I felt compelled to write a blog post about it, saying like, look, this is probably empirically effective, but think about the quality of the people that you will be bringing in. And if you bring people in by brainwashing, you are going to be bringing in probably lower quality people and people that will be swayed back easily. You're better off. And this is maybe the idealist in me who didn't know.
As I always say, the problem with being a cult leader is dealing with cult members. If you bring in low level cult members, who are easily persuaded into being a cult, those are your new friends. That's who you have to deal with, is these morons. Yeah.
There's a dangerous kind of emotional psychological contradiction there, I thought, where if you manipulate someone into taking a position in this way, and you are aware of the manipulative tools that you're using to bring people that way, it's going to be extremely difficult, maybe impossible in the long run, to respect the people that you have persuaded. And you will come to look at them as pawns and tools. And this is a movement that's supposed to be founded upon loving your people or whatever.
Yes.
So, but this was all going down back in 2012, 2013, 2014, or so, maybe a little bit later than that. So like there's some deep stuff going on, and it is interesting to see how that has, where that has arrived at here in 2024. And the one name that James Lindsay was unequivocal in saying and bringing out was Nick Fuentes. And I think in association with Nick Fuentes, we can list a couple other names because they're associated with him, and that would be Kanye West and Milo Yiannopoulos. I think.
I just think of Nick as being the new Milo.
In many ways,
yeah. I mean, because I don't even like to spend too much time on him because I hate seeing images of him because there are people who are hiding in plain sight. And if you look at him, you already know what he is. You know, there's a certain person I know who looks like they should be selling things out of the back of who I fell for, I fell for their bullshit, but they look like they should be selling things out of the back of a Cadillac. But it's like, oh, okay, you look like exactly what you are. And Nick Fuentes looks like someone that you should not listen to. In the way that lesbians with purple hair look like someone you should not listen to, Nick Fuentes also looks like something you would not listen to, and his presentation looks like I feel like if you know people, you're like, why are you listening to this kid? Like, why are you listening to this kid in my basement saying all this stuff? And it's just because he's in the way that Milo, it's like, well, why would you listen to Milo? He's ridiculous. Like, he's obviously ridiculous. He's always been ridiculous. And but like people like him because he's spicy and he says really provocative things because he likes attention.
Well,
whatever his attention brings attention, he will say it. You know.
Well, we've entered this kind of political landscape where we're kind of through, I think, collectively with reasonable discussion. We don't want to hear people saying interesting things that may or may not persuade us. We want champions that are simultaneously going to take it to the other side and bitch slap our enemies for us, and also are amusing while they do so. And so what you have in Nick Fuentes and Milo Yiannopoulos and many other characters in this way are characters, and they have different kind of strategies for doing this with preemptively ridiculous personalities that make them very hard to dismiss as ridiculous because they've preemptively embraced it. So it's a defensive postmodern kind of maneuver. And you'll see this with when TV commentator pundits like Rachel Maddow or there are right-wing ones that suffer this too, when they're gone after for libel or for telling untruth. Their defense is, well, I'm not telling the news, I'm an entertainer. And that actually works as a defense.
Alex Jones said that too.
Yes, exactly. Alex Jones said that. And I think what you have with Milo Yiannopoulos and Nick Fuentes, and even with Tim Pool will even say, I'm just some guy on the internet saying my opinion. It's like, that is true and also not a complete description of what you're doing. So there's that dynamic, but we're also looking for champions that will take it to the other side. And I think one of the, if I can name drop a little more, as tasteless as that can be, I think this one's particularly illustrative. There are a number of what we call internet blood sports debating personalities. Some of which are legitimate and are serious people. I would put Jay Dyer in that category. I've had the displeasure of debating him. It was not a good time, but I respect him. He's serious about what he does, and he's sincere in that regard. Then there are people like Andrew Wilson, whose whole shtick is to go on like feminist podcasts and basically say such hard right stuff that he induces a kind of deer in the headlights response from these college girls with no experience of the world who've never heard this kind of thing before. And he says it so boldly and aggressively, and like it's the most obvious thing in the world. And it's the exact opposite of everything these girls have been taught, that he just stuns them into silence. And he does this over and over again. And it's kind of a shtick. And people on the far right can't get enough of watching this. So there's a little bit of that dynamic going on. And I think Nick Fuentes has a little bit of that flair, a little bit of that ability.
Yeah, I mean, people want to, I mean, it's like people want people who dunk on the libs, you know, like, and can go and shock people and whatever and say things that people are thinking. But, I mean, he represents something that we'll get to, I think, in a minute. But what I thought I might do is talk about the alt-right, because this is what we can add context to.
Yes.
I mean, you said added some great context. and I figured I'd add a little context of what the alt-right was, and then we can talk about these different groups. First, I did want to say, yeah, like I don't think like he identified paleocons.
Yes.
And paleocon, I mean, I say this every once in a while, but and it probably people bring it up in a bad way, but I always say that I learned how to write essays from Pat Buchanan and Anton LaVey. Which is a great combination. But Pat Buchanan writes fantastic essays. Wrote just everything's bookended. I mean, he wrote speeches for Nixon. He's amazing. And so I read a lot of Pat Buchanan, and because I was genuinely and that was when I was kind of becoming a conservative or becoming more on that side of things. I don't really like the word conservative, but like I was moving towards that direction. And so I was reading a lot of Pat Buchanan in the 2000s. And so I've been aware of paleocons for a really long time, and I don't see them as an anti-American, like free speech force in the world. I don't see it like, and he identified Tucker Carlson as being a paleocon, and I don't really see those guys as being that kind of thing. And also, I mean, they're most of them are Catholic paleocons, and America is not going to become a Catholic country anytime soon. That's not even a problem. It's not going to happen.
We did just have a Catholic president, so you got to be careful.
Right, and you got J.D. Vance in there, and he's Catholic now. So there's that. But yeah, exactly. But generally speaking, I mean, the power in the Christian community, the power comes from Protestants.
Evangelicals.
Yeah, evangelicals, but just generally Protestants. And so like that's really what you have in America. And so I wanted to give a little bit of a history of the alt-right from where my perspective, because like I said, I was there when it was written. What was happening, and you were watching this too, I think at this time, was in around 2010. A lot of guys were waking up to different things, and they were seeing that the media was lying to them. And so like this whole thing where if you say that the media is lying to you, or you say that you're being sold a false story, automatically makes you woke. I think that that's a bad direction to go, because the media was lying, so like, and it was lying about a lot of things. It was lying about the way it talked about men and women. It was lying about the way it talked about race. I mean, it was hiding racial statistics. Like everything was set in an unfair way.
Yeah.
And people were realizing this, and it was in the manosphere and the blogosphere and guys like Chateau Hartiste were writing about the kind of male-female dynamics in a different way. And you had all these people who were like into evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology and all those kind of things. And they were talking about what's really happening versus what were being told. And as I often cited, and this was before 2010, but Steven Pinker's The Blank Slate kind of took apart a lot of these ideas in academia. And so there were just a lot of guys who were talking about different things. And on the conservative right, the normal right, what you had, just basic Republicans, you had a lot of guys who just weren't aware that any of this was happening. They were just like head in the sand. We care about money and the war on terror, and they cared about they were these like boomers who cared about the dumbest things. They just like, we care about hating the gays and like we don't care about the environment, and there were a lot of people who were like, what the alt-right originally was, at least in my perception of what Richard Spencer was putting together at that time, was people who were just really, who were not on the left, but were just really dissatisfied with what the right meant.
Yeah. Can I give a little historical background leading up to this? Because
sure.
There's another prominent member of the alternative right pre-Charlottesville, which would better have been called the dissident right, because it wasn't really one thing. It was a collection of a variety of different people who believed a variety of, like you said, interesting, different, and often mutually exclusive things that were just dissatisfied with the right. But one of these characters was a Christian blogger named Vox Day, Theodore Beale, who writes out
Yeah.
of Italy now. He's written some very interesting books, and one of them was called Cuckservative. It was a very, very anti-establishment conservative book, along with a co-author, Red Eagle. And they basically described how the right, the political institutional right, circled the wagons from 1955 under William F. Buckley after he created the National Review. And what William F. Buckley was doing was basically putting himself in a gatekeeper role to say this is a true conservative and this is out. And the primary victim of that were the John Birch Society. Does that ring a bell? John Birch Society, I think, was the main target of his thing. But basically, he created a gatekeeping system for what was permissibly according to taste, like a respectable conservative position, and what was not. His whole thing was respectability. And so under William F. Buckley and the sort of tradition he established, influence, a lot of various kinds of conservative thinkers, not just John Birch Society members, but others as well, were basically kicked out of the establishment. And so they just had to kind of simmer through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But then the internet came around. And suddenly these people were able to organize and start communicating with each other and finding each other and talking. And they could write, and they could not just organize and speak amongst themselves, but even figure out ways to get information out into the public outside of their little bubble that they had been, walled in by the William F. Buckleys and, of course, the leftists of the world. And so all of these kinds of thinkers that had been simmering kind of under the table and developing their ideas and building them, kind of the descendants of those emerged in what became the dissident right. And it was kind of a strange movement because it started with a bunch of, if I remember correctly, Silicon Valley tech people who were like, what if we redesigned nation states without human biases from like a computer's perspective, basically? What would be the optimal way to design a society? And there were two thinkers that were really kind of at the fore in that sort of digital world, and those were Curtis Yarvin, who is writing under the name Mencius Bullbug, and Nick Land. And neither of them were racists by any stretch of the imagination, nor were they traditionalists. Nick Land was some kind of weird like tech accelerationist guy, and Curtis Yarvin is famous for being a monarchist, or as he calls it, a royalist, following a kind of CEO model of executive power. But so clearly not classical right-wing thinkers, but also not just 90s neo-Nazis either. And there's a bunch of other thinkers, which did include neo-Nazis and also some other completely unrelated lines of thought. And then Charlottesville happened.
Well, hold on. Let's calm down before we get to, because that's 7 years.
Right. That's true.
That's 7 years.
Yeah.
So like I said, when alt-right happened in like 2010, what you had is like when I was asked to write for it, I mean, I thought of it as being, like more dissident right, like an alternative to the right. That's what it was like framed as. It wasn't framed as like a white nationalist thing. It wasn't framed as like an anti-Semitic thing. It wasn't framed as any of that. It was basically a whole bunch of people who were just like, these conservatives are gross, but also liberals are gross too. And like, we want something different. So I ended up writing about masculinity for the alt-right because I was writing about things, like that was right when before I think The Way of Men came out. And I was writing about like, here, these are problems with feminism. These are problems that men are facing. This is not, and the conservative perspective on that kind of thing at that time was like, shut up and go to church and get a wife. And like, if she divorces you, it's your fault. was basically like, that was the conservative line. That was what Christians were saying. That was the conservative line. Nobody wanted anything to do with masculinity. It was still like, you guys are losers if anything bad is happening. And there's no problem. And they just weren't addressing feminism. They weren't addressing any of these issues that were coming, these things that were coming up the pike, which was going to turn into like trans and woke and whatever. All this academic feminism that was coming to a head in Marxism and whatever, all the woke shit was already bubbling up, and had been since the 70s, 80s, 90s. And so it was already there. And so I was writing about that. But what you also had at the alt-right were paleocons. Someone brought up the name John Derbyshire to me the other day, and I was like, wow, I haven't heard that in like 10 years.
He's excellent.
Yeah, I mean, he was an intellectual figure who was writing. Paul Gottfried was like a big guy who was like super influential in creating that whole thing, and he was a Jewish like professor, and so he was this Jewish professor conservative who was just kind of anti a lot of the ideas behind liberalism. You had pagans. A few people wrote about, they had the guy from the AFA come in and write.
And there was also the more hardcore libertarian crowd. There was like before Chris Cantwell went off the rails, he was kind of an interesting character on that side, and then he became significantly less interesting. But basically, everyone who read Hans Hermann Hoppe's Democracy, the God That Failed, and said that was mind-changing. And so they had these kind of libertarian feudalists, which sounds like a weird oxymoron, but it kind of follows from this Hans Hermann Hoppe scholarship documenting the historical failures of democracy basically everywhere where it was tried.
Right. And so there were those, and I forgot until you just mentioned that there are hard libertarians. At that point, we actually had some like people who called themselves anarchists writing for the alt-right. And well, not just anarcho-capitalists, just anarchists generally.
Just anarchists.
Not the like left anarchists. Maybe they were anarcho-capitalists, but there was another blog that was associated with, and he would do guest spots on alternative right.
Who's the Anarchy State and Utopia guy? Was that Nozick?
But that wasn't him. It was I think his name is Keith Preston, if I can remember. But I think he like reviewed Way of Men when it came out because I was in contact with them. So it was this very ragtag group of people who didn't actually have a lot in common of different things, and so it was really sad. Yeah, someone in the comments. I'm actually seeing comments from X on my interface here, which is cool. Someone says my mic is off. I know it's a lavalier mic. I've been trying to fight the big black mic thing, but maybe I'll have to do it for better sound at some point. And then somebody mentioned culture of critique. We'll get to that. And Stefan Molyneux, someone brought him up. I mean, he was actually even a little later, I think. But I mean, all this was before you had your Jordan Peterson and all that, and then it evolved to the point. White nationalists were in the mix, but they were not the whole mix.
They weren't even the majority.
And then it slowly no, not at the beginning. But like in alt-right specifically, in Richard Spencer's projects, then it became radix. Like he closed down alt-right, and then it became radix. And then he got in line with some like conservative publishing dynasty people that got money for this NPI Institute. So it was one of these fake think tank organizations they have all over Washington. Everybody has a think tank, and they all have very like inane names that don't really mean anything. And so it was the National Policy Institute. And so we were speaking. I was just speaking at events for the National Policy Institute for a little bit. And again, it was very kind of mixed up crowd, but there were a lot of like white nationalists there, and it slowly became explicitly white nationalists. And I kind of became a little bit more like, I was doing a Hunter S. Thompson thing here, and I was saying, you're right about these things, and not right about these things, but like playing okay, I care about masculinity, that's my issue. I don't really care about the race thing as much as you guys do. But that became impossible to maintain after Charlottesville. Like I'm like, well, you kind of had to like, okay, these guys are just doing. If you're going to march with Nazis, that's what you are. Like that's okay. If you're going to do that, then that's who you are now. And so everybody had to like kind of, I just kind of pushed that all away and was like, okay, I'm done being associated with alt-right. And alt-right kind of died after that because then they got the media attention they asked for. I mean, even some of the articles that were written about me during that time, I was already saying before Charlottesville, I was like the worst one, the philosophical fascists of the alt-right, that lying whore. I mean, to say it indelicately, this bitch called me up and was so sweet to me and said, I was like, hey, I really don't want to talk about the alt-right. I'm kind of putting some distance there. That's not really where I'm at right now. But I did write one of the most popular books about masculinity on the market. We could talk about masculinity. I'd really like to talk about that. And she's like, okay. And so we talked about masculinity and all this stuff. And then she puts me in an article called The Philosophical Fascists of the Alt-Right in the alt-right issue of this New York magazine. I'm like, you fucking lying bitch. And I sent her an email. I'm like, are you serious? Like, this is not what we talked about at all. And but anyway, that's history, and that's when I learned about reporters in New York. But so anyway, it's all that happened, and the alt-right kind of went away. And then we got.
And we should put a flag in here a minute, because we're talking about the woke right here. None of this stuff in the dissident right, which came to be known as the pre-Charlottesville alt-right,
right,
was predicated on any kind of notion that the world is an illusion. There's a ragtag.
I would disagree.
Really? Okay. I guess my impression was that a lot of the people there had particular objects of focus that they thought were not getting enough attention. But let me rephrase it. I would say they no more think the world is an illusion than we could say that liberals, when they were discussing religious theology of the past, thought that the religious view of the world was an illusion. So
right, and that's where the woke thing kind of falls apart, because there's levels to this, and is anyone who believes in a conspiracy that was actually true woke? Is everybody after everyone was woke after 2020, and they lied to us about every fucking thing. Okay, we're all woke after that. It's one of those things that you can take too far, and that's why I think it kind of loses the plot of what woke was, because it really does make sense for what James Lindsay was talking about, as far as like woke Marxism and the woke movement and where they're going and where their ideological history was. The only thing that applies to, I think, is, I guess we'll just do this now, anti-Semitism.
Yes.
And that is the one thing that is extremely religious. That is a religious viewpoint. It is not. All these other things, I think, involve legitimate critiques of liberalism. And there are, you can, if you're going to have liberalism, it has to be able to be critiqued. And that's fine.
I think this is one of James Lindsay's more valuable contributions to this discussion. It's just so what he is trying to counter are these critiques of liberalism. And if I could have my way, my dream, I would set up a debate between James Lindsay and Sargon of Akkad, or Carl Benjamin, who has recently, after decades of being a liberal, has realized that liberalism is actually something he doesn't support, and he calls himself post-liberal now.
Right, which is what all these guys were doing back then.
Right, right.
He kind of inherited this post-liberal thing
to what we're doing. But what James Lindsay has done that I think is so valuable is he's distinguishing between different kinds of liberalism, different schools of liberalism. And the one that James Lindsay has a particular attachment to is what he calls the Scottish Enlightenment.
Which,
as opposed to French Enlightenment, which is a very valuable distinction to have. And we could throw it to Carl at that point and say, is there a distinction after all, or like, are we dealing with something else? But anyways, I just
Yeah,
wanted
it seems like he. Yeah, I like that he pointed that out because what he was talking about seemed to be much more rooted in common sense.
yes,
And like, hey, the real world exists, and we're not, like that's
natural law.
why. So the solar idealism is kind of a confusing thing because there is an idealist movement which has nothing to do with what we're talking about. We're talking about idealism in the form in the way that normal people understand it, rather than like German idealism, which
Right.
is I had to look that up, and I'm like, no, that's not what we're doing.
No,
But so
back to the Jews.
the Jews. Here's where it becomes. I know it's like this is going to trigger a lot of people, but here's where it becomes very. The thing about the Jews is that that's where it becomes religious for a lot of these guys, and that is the one truth that opens up all truths for them. And once people have fed them this thing that Jews are basically responsible for everything bad that you could possibly imagine in the world, which doesn't explain Asia very well at all. But they don't talk about that. Everything bad that has ever, it really is happening in Western society is the direct result of the Jews. And that's what they're saying. That's not what I'm saying. That is what they're saying. And once you
posted.
I know. That's why I have to like break it up with like whatever, because that is not what I'm saying. In fact, I'm saying not that, because it's bullshit. But what if you can get a guy to believe that the Jews are the source of all bad things, it becomes an answer to every question. And everyone who disputes that is now, you're controlled by the Jews. Like everyone, it's exactly the same as the woke thing. It is a gnostic. It has opened up a world that no one can see, that the Jews control all of it. And they're controlling you. They're controlling you. You don't even know it. They're controlling women. They're controlling everything. The blacks and everything. The Jews control all things. That's what they're saying. And every guy who goes down this path, I feel like he's lost to me. I've spent hours talking to really guys who could have been really good guys and were really good guys, and they get into this rabbit hole with this. And they can't get out because it explains everything. And there's enough evidence that it becomes very convincing. And it's easy enough to take apart, but once you've taken this as an article of faith that Jews are responsible for all bad things, then it makes life so much simpler because it's the answer to every problem that you possibly have.
Yeah.
Like in that meme, like, oh, there's a I stuck a stick in my bike. Oh, the Jews. It's basically that. That's the way they think of it. And it's sad because the thing is, where they get you is that, I've been around this table with these guys so many times, and I've heard literally every argument that they ever possibly could have. And where they get you is like, someone like me, okay.
There wasn't enough time. How did they get all those people into the ovens? There wasn't enough time.
Let's not even go to that point. I don't even want to open that up. But they get to a point where they said to me, like someone like me, okay, well, I've been an opponent of feminism. Well, if you look up a list, there's a list of Jewish feminists on Wikipedia, and it's everyone that you've ever heard of. And you're like, and you can do that with almost anything bad, because, and so if people can stack enough of these comparisons, you can turn a guy over, like you'd be like, maybe it is, and then, but hold on, it's, Jewish people Ashkenazi Jews tend to be a higher IQ, and they're also highly represented in all intellectual endeavors.
Yeah. So this is the one that I always, and so like, I always got into was we'd be talking about communism or Marxism with someone, and they would say, well, all the most prominent Marxists are all Jews. And
Oh
my
yeah.
default answer was like, that might be true. And also Ayn Rand and Murray Rothbard and all the super prominent anti-communists are also Jews. You have all these people on the far left that are Jews. Well, look, here's Curtis Yarvin, who's also Jew. So like maybe you have these people that are just drawn to ideas. Like there's also a conspiracy, if you want to get into it, that math is a secret plan by the Chinese and the Indians. Because look at all the most successful math. I'm kidding, by the way, but you could construct this kind of associative logic around all kinds of things, and the point that becomes apparent when you dig into any kind of ethnography of these sorts of stories in history is talking about people, and all of us are familiar with this when it comes to whites, as if the Germans and the English were the same people that agreed on everything and never disagreed, or
Yeah.
the Jews were also not a monolithic group. And the
Right.
history of the Second World War, as far as the covering up of the Holocaust, was largely a history of German-speaking high Jews in the United States who were embarrassed by and didn't want to have anything to do with their Yiddish-speaking Jewish European cousins, the sort of cousins we don't talk about for matters of class and taste,
Right.
assisting in the covering up of that, so that they could advance a narrative of Nazi Germany. Not that they were out to purge Europe of Jewish influence, but they were out to take over Europe completely, which was not true.
Yeah.
So it was, but it was necessary to advance a narrative that Hitler wanted to take over the world, to motivate the rest of the world to participate in the Second World War, because frankly, the
Right.
rest of the World War wasn't particularly concerned about protecting Jews. So
Right.
like
Right. At that time, it was pretty normal to not like them. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and meanwhile, Hitler misunderstood the United States and thought the United States would try to jump in because he thought the United States was controlled by Jews. Whereas the Jews in the United States are like, oh yeah, don't worry about those Jews. We don't want to deal with those Jews. So it's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
treating the Jews as a monolith is ahistorical.
Right.
As far as we can tell, my favorite example of this, not with the Jews, but with whites and with Native Americans in United States history, is the novel Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper, where you have a Scottish general that's up against a French general that is allied with one Amerindian tribe, but then there's these other Amerindian tribes, and they all have different kind of biases. They all have different impressions of the natures of these different tribes, these different races, these different groups from Europe and stuff. But they're all different from each other. And to think of those groups as what, and in many cases those biases are right, and in many cases those biases are wrong. But the to group them all together as white or as Native American, when these different tribes have their own preferences and their own natures, just as we could break that down further and say, well, actually individuals within those tribes are also different from each other, which is also obviously true. Like it is it's just a very low resolution take, and it provides less explanatory power when you zoom in on the precise details of history rather than just speaking in broad terms about, well, like, oh, the USS Liberty, or oh, this or that. And it's like, well, if you look at politics in Israel just today,
Yeah.
you will see a politics that is profoundly divided. I mean, not so much in the last year, but year and a month. But
Yeah.
over the past 5 or 6 years, there's profound disagreements there, just as there are in the United States.
Yeah. And that's something that has to be separated too. because as far as from the woke, when we're talking about the woke or whatever, that James Lindsay kind of ran these things together, and I think in a way that triggers a lot of people, because there's criticism of Israel, and that's one thing. And I will say personally that I don't, like for saying the things I said 5 minutes ago, I'll probably be like, he's being paid by the Jews. Man, I wish I was getting paid by the Jews. I could use the extra. I could use the cash, man. But criticism, like, I don't care what happens to Israel, and I think that's where a lot of Americans are, and I think that's what maybe James is calling that woke and isolationist and whatever. But it's like America doesn't have any money. Like it's like
native money.
Yeah, it's fake money that, like, it's like the deficit is gigantic. Like, they're worried about, like, Social Security, whether they can actually keep it. All these things. America doesn't have the money to, like, spend on infinite amounts of wars. Mm-hmm. I think most people feel that way, and most people feel like, hey, I'm struggling. Things aren't as good as they used to be. I don't want my tax dollars being taken and spent on wars about places that I've never been and will never go to and don't care about. And I don't think that that's an anti-Semitic position. That's, I think, a very normal American position, that people are like, hey, I don't care about that. I'll never go there. I don't know what happens there. That is like a magical
outside of our jurisdiction.
This is not, it's not my rodeo. I don't care. And so that's, I think, criticism of, hey, stop sending our money to Israel is, or like, we don't need to be involved in that, or stop sending money to Ukraine, or any of that. That is not anti-Semitism. I think that needs to be separated from it. But there are groups of pro-Israel groups that will make that into anti-Semitism, but it's not. And I think there's nothing woke about criticizing Israel, but there is. But when you get into, like, this idea that the Jew, someone said I'm getting shoulder shekels. Like I said, if I can give them, like, they can pay me in Bitcoin, whatever. I'll take some money from the Jews.
We'll take the money and then also say that
I just happen to have this opinion because I'm so sick of dealing with. And this is where I think too. Dealing with like Nietzsche had this exact same problem, and I think that, like, he said some critical things about Jews and some of the things that he wrote, but then his sister was this rabid anti-Semitist, anti-Semite, and her husband was even worse, and I think they even moved to Argentina or did a thing like that, and had a failed commune there or something like that, and I think that I can imagine Nietzsche thinking, super high level thoughts, and having to sit at dinner with his sister and her husband and listening to him going on about the Jews for like an hour, and like being like, "Fuck these people," I feel like that's where I am because I had to do that too.
He has the perfect line for this too, because we've taken a break from the Odyssey, and we've just described Odysseus, passing by the island of the Sirens and hearing this songs. Right. And so he decides he's going to bind himself to the mast so that he doesn't follow their songs. At the end of the tarantula section in Thus Spake Zarathustra, Nietzsche says, describes being bit by the tarantula, this creature of resentment. Its poison is resentment and hatred. And he says, yea, it hath revenged itself, and alas, now will it make my soul also dizzy with revenge. That I may not turn dizzy, however, bind me fast, my friends, to this pillar. Rather will I be a pillar saint than a whirl of vengeance. Verily, no cyclone or whirlwind is Zarathustra. If he be a dancer, he is not at all a tarantula dancer. In other words, even if everything that the anti-Semites of the alt-right had to say was true, and that it was a conspiracy of Zionist control or whatever, Nietzsche is saying, I would still choose to avert my gaze from that to avoid the spiritual poison that is resentment. Now, the book of Nietzsche's that I read the most persistently and thoroughly was the Antichrist, which was simultaneously a dive into the deepest questions of what they call the JQ, the Jewish question, and an emergence out the other side. Because he described the Jews as a profoundly interesting people, and he looked unflinchingly, because it was fashionable in the 19th century to talk about different people was having different natures, and there was few people that Nietzsche hated by their nature more than the Germans. English were up there. English were up there. The Germans were highest. He liked the Greeks, and that was like about it as far as I could tell. But he had a kind of I'll call a cautious admiration for the Jews, because he said, upon careful consideration, and I'm doing this from memory, so I don't think I have this verbatim, but he said, upon careful consideration of the question to be or not to be, he said the Jews decided to be at any price. And the price they chose to pay was very high. Now, Nietzsche was the yes to life guy. So there's something admirable to Nietzsche in that choice, but the strategies that he thought that the Jewish people facing some of the most intense persecution in history, in the Middle Ages and so forth, chose for preservation, were dangerous to the people around them. And he said, we should be mindful of this and be aware of it. But there was still admiration in that description. Now, people might agree or disagree with his characterization of it, but Nietzsche's view of it went through anti-Semitism and came out the other side, without resentment, without anti-Semitism. In fact, it was so profoundly anti-Semitism that he cut off his relations with Richard Wagner over the very question. And on that note, I feel like it's worth addressing Daniel Rose here. He asked a very good question in the YouTube comments. He says, paranoia. Well, first he says human conspiracy carries different implications.
I was going to read that because that's actually a really good,
very, very true.
Now I just talked over you, so let's read it again.
Oh, you're good.
So,
he says human conspiracy carries different implications than cosmic conspiracy. Absolutely. Very true.
Yes.
But he also says, paranoia notwithstanding, identifying a human enemy motivated by self-interest is not the same as claiming a cosmic gnosis that imagines all who disagree as agents of ultimate ignorance and evil. Jewish fixation may be more like the latter, but I question its prevalence. Well, it is not just prevalent, but it feels like it's becoming more prevalent by the month, partially because of the whole situation in Palestine, Gaza, West Bank.
Right.
But the thing that I would point to as the evidence for the sort of religiosity that you alluded to before, the point about the fixation, because when asked about anti-Semitism, Christopher Hitchens said, I always felt like I noticed, I'm quoting Hitchens, a kind of a degree of mental illness, a kind of fixation in that, something about the way it's talked about. And I think it comes to, because the dynamic that people are complaining about with Israel, foreign influence, diaspora populations is true. It is a real thing to be concerned about, especially dual loyalty citizenships, contrary to what our future Secretary of State or Defense might have to say about it. That is something that we should be concerned about. It would be no less an object of concern if it was Chinese or Indian influence. Now, as someone who grew up on the West Coast of the United States, Western Washington, Seattle, Bellevue area, Indian influence is profound. Microsoft culture is Indian culture, largely. And you see this also in the United Kingdom, in Britain. The Indian and the Indian influence there is a little bit different because they have their imperial legacy and connection to India. But in the United States, you have essentially diaspora populations of all kinds, and there are certainly American diaspora populations. In Mexico, for example, we have like English speaking Mormon populations in Mexico, living as like diaspora populations there, and large populations of boomer men in Thailand looking for women or not women, things of that nature. And for all the groups there, the focus among these alt-right people still is largely Jewish. We could say they are perhaps just stuck in the 20th century. The 21st century is a little different, but I think it's more to your point that there's a religious kind of gnostic, I've unlocked the secret of reality and of history tone to the way this subject is discussed.
There is, and like I said, it's been in my personal experience, like direct personal experience, many times. And you get those guys in the comments, and it's, if you say something that's even tangentially related to it, they'll bring up the Jew, because they want to talk about it, because that's all they have to talk about anymore. It's like that, the fungus that takes over the insect, and then that becomes what they are, and that just motivates them and runs them. And it really is all that they have to talk about. And I've lost guys that I had like friends that because I'm like, I can't have that around me. And it's like, you're not interesting anymore because all you want to talk about is that one thing. And what I have to say to this, and maybe I'll write this up as a very spicy essay someday, but what I have to say to these guys is that, okay, you have this, my argument against anti-Semitism, aside from the fact that it's just not based in fact. Like there's a lot of things that are confusing about it, about their arguments.
I'll quote you, like it's incomplete because they do have some facts. They do have some facts.
Yeah, I mean, they do have some facts. They're not wrong about everything.
But what are the odds that what are the odds that the official history of the Second World War is accurate? Probably about the same that the official story of any historical event is accurate, which is zero.
Exactly. And so, but okay, so you have this truth that you know. Let's say that it's true. You have this truth that you know about the world, about this people that control everything, and they only want to do people like you harm. And they've been doing this for a really long time. And as they'll tell you, they've been kicked out of tons of countries and all this kind of stuff. They've been doing this for a really long time. And once you know this truth, you can't unsee it, because they control everything all around you. So once upon a time, there was a man with a little mustache, and he wanted to solve this problem, and he tried really hard, and he had superior technology, an entire powerful nation on his side, and the support of that nation, like the wholehearted support of that nation. And the only thing that he succeeded in doing was making this group of people far more powerful than they had been before. And so, knowing that you will never get the entire nation that you're trying to convince on board, and knowing that you won't have the superior technology and the military might, and that you're not going to go conquer the world, how are you going to get rid of this problem that you see as a problem? Like, what are you going to do about it? Is there a solution? Do you actually have a solution? Now, there was a man who had a final solution, but it actually wasn't final because he didn't get it done. And he had the best chance of anyone in history of getting that done. And he did not do it and made them more powerful. So if that's your argument, that you need to wake men up so that they know, because this is what they do. They want to wake others up the same way of the woke thing. That's why it fits the profile. They want to wake men up so that they understand this truth, but they have no solution for this problem.
Well, and their way of thinking takes them to very silly places too, because whenever you see the entirety of the complexity of the world as decided by a single factor,
Right.
you'll start neglecting important factors. And I think Israel, the conflict in Palestine is a good example of this, because you'll see a lot of these people more or less explicitly taking Palestine's side. Now, I think we are too close to Israel, personally.
Hold on,
my
before
personal
we get there,
but
let me
anyways,
finish where we're going.
I'm
because
sorry.
because that's going to derail where we're at. But my point here is, okay, so you have this. If you actually believe this, let's say I don't believe it for the reasons that you're saying, and yes, it creates logical problems and all this kind of stuff. But if you actually believe it, and you believe that there was this guy who tried to solve this problem, it's a problem, and this guy who tried to solve this problem, and he was unable to do it with basically the best chance that anyone could ever have to do it. What are you doing? What is your end game? And they don't have one. So they have this problem without a solution. And they want to go around waking other guys up, even though if they woke up 60% of the United States to started believing this religious belief that they have, it's still not enough to get that job done.
Yeah.
So if you isn't what you're doing actually evil? You're going around getting men angry about a thing that you have no idea how to fix. And that really can't, even if, like I said, this isn't actually a problem, I don't think it's the same problem, but isn't that actually a terrible thing to do? Because once the guy wakes up to that, that's all he can talk about. That's all his, everything's bad. I've been around these guys.
It's climate alarmism for the right.
Yeah, and the thing is, it gets down to the point where I remember being around groups of people like this, and you couldn't like anything that was done by a Jew. If you mentioned anything that you like that was the work of a Jew, then oh well, blah 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 blah. That's their whole world, and that's why it's so religious. It's like my favorite production of my favorite symphony is done by Leonard Bernstein, and if you're hanging out with guys like that, you don't even want to bring that up, because you know exactly the scene at the end. You know where that discussion is going to go in 5 minutes, because that's all that they have to talk about. You cannot like the Beastie Boys. You cannot like anything that Jews have, all the cool things that Jews have done that are great in the world. You cannot like any of them because you believe this truth. And so to put men in that position and make them have that life, isn't that bad? In itself, even if you say you're a racist and you love white guys and whatever, and you want to save the white man, but you have no solution to fix the problem that you say is the biggest problem in the world, isn't it? You're just going to make these guys unsuccessful and unhappy. That's all that you're bringing them. That's all you have to offer them is being, but they'll know the truth and just be unsuccessful and unhappy.
I think you sold me. Yeah, it is. I think so. So James woke description. I still don't like woke because it's linguistically left coded now. But as far as having,
I don't think it's productive.
A gnostic, a sort of right-wing gnostic worldview, and you'll hear people actually explicitly talk about. I got into this very annoying Instagram argument before I eventually blocked him, or he blocked me, one or the other, with this gnostic character who's like, what the demiurge is a symbol for, right? And I'm like, well, I didn't, but I can read between the lines and I already know what you mean. So yeah, it's explicit in some cases, or right on the edge of explicit while still being technically implicit. So yeah, it's on that note, I guess there is but the thing I was trying to say before is the silliness of it is that it expresses itself in it takes you to weird and stupid places, because another group that holds the West to be Satan, the great Satan, and worthy of destruction, are the more militant Muslim factions
Sure.
in the world. And in the same way that on the left, you have like alliances between groups that should ideologically oppose each other, like, you know, pick a faction. The gays for Islam thing that was popular in like 2015 was like, it's not a good combo there, but
Silly faggots.
Yeah. Do you know what defenestration means? But like you get a similar tendency on the right, where militant Islam is no friend of the West, and there's linguistic reasons for that. There's ideological, historical reasons for that, and you have people who are like, who take it, the enemy of my enemy is my friend attitude, and you're taking like, you know, sides with a group that actively dislikes you and wants to colonize you against a group that is, you know, trying to survive and has done some bad things, you know, but maybe if your two enemies are fighting, just let them fight. You don't need to take a side.
Yeah, I feel like that's what
side.
Sun Tzu would say: if your enemies are trying to destroy each other, let them. Like, right. Yeah. You know, I mean, it's, yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, it's, I mean, like, woke is not the right term for it, but there is the similar impulse there. I think woke just confuses the issue of like, what is it? I mean, anti-Semitism already had a name.
So what, you know, what would we
and
call...
actually, it's a kind of a dumb name because it's like this Semitism. Semites are a bigger group of people. It's actually all those people. It doesn't include the Arabs as well.
Technically, yes.
Yeah. So I mean, it's not a good word. So maybe we need a better word for that. What
would we call this thing then?
I mean, like I said, I feel like anti-Semitism is not the right word. I'd have to like play word games for a while to figure out what's something better. But that's the real problem. I mean, he brought up Nick Fuentes. That's kind of Nick Fuentes' whole thing, is like hating the Jews, and that's all those guys who are really a problem are, you know, like that's really the worst influence, and not because of the Jews specifically, but because of what you said about their happens to their spirit in a Nietzschean sense. And they become so possessed by resentment because it's these people controlling them that, you know, they become poisoned by it. Did I lose Chris? I did. I lost Chris. He'll pump back in a second. But anyway, I think it's not the most productive term in the world. Woke right. I wouldn't use it against just because I don't like someone's opinion. Like I don't know how I feel about post-liberalism. I don't really care to it. I think that we have the system that we have right now, and there are a lot of things I like about it. I'm a big free speech guy, and I always have been, and I think that that's what people voted for.
Sorry,
that's all right. I had to take over the show for you for a second, but it became a Jack show for a minute. But I was just saying that I think what people voted for in the last election was not the extreme right likes to imagine that it's where they're going. They're going to end up where we are, but they're not. All the people who made this happen, the Joe Rogans and the Elon Musks, and they're not on that page. And RFK, they're not on the page. They want like basic American values, and they want Americans to be prosperous, and they want the government to be less corrupt, and they want to back away from the woke shit. You know, like, and they are not going to. I think what James Lindsay is right about is that it's right to keep these guys at bay. Like, no, I mean, I do that with the Order of Fire, with my people who comment on my stuff. I mean, if you start posting Nazi stuff and anti-Jew stuff and whatever in my feed, I'm just going to block you. I won't have it. I'm not dealing with that guy. I'm not having that discussion. I'm not having a debate about it. Just no. In the same way that I'm not going to debate with some little girl with purple hair or like weird groomers and whatever. No, like we're not doing it. And I feel like that paternal no is the best response to both of these problems. Is that you're going to talk about the Jews for 3 hours? No, we're not doing that.
Yeah.
When you give those guys an opening, that's what it's the same thing again in his defense of the woke right. In the same way with Marxism, that if you give them an opening, they're going to create a web of words to trap you in. And we're going to have a long word game about they have all these things. And I don't think it's worth entertaining. And the same thing, it's basically because I already have. But there's going to be this, but what about this? But what about this? But what about this? But what about this? These keep going on and on and on and on and become time wasters. And we should be focused right now on becoming prosperous again, and becoming healthy again, and all these things that are like really positive directions, and not be sucked into this tunnel of we hate these people and they're putting us down and all this stuff like that. That can't be where we go right now. So anyway, I'll let you jump back in now, but that was where I was going with that.
No, that's a good. It's good. I forget where I was trying to go before that. Oh, I was thinking about what would be if woke right is like kind of correct, but maybe not quite the right name. What would be a good name for this element? Because what James Lindsay was describing was much broader, and he includes anti-liberals and people who think that maybe the American Constitution got some things wrong, which I would disagree with, but there are valid arguments. I wouldn't say correct arguments, but interesting arguments there that are not based upon some kind of Gnostic world. And I mean, James Lindsay described, he said, I feel like I'm in 2014 again. I'm seeing the roots of this thing that is going to grow into something bigger. And that's really what this whole conversation is about. Where exactly was the cause of the problems we're seeing now? Was it 3 years ago? Was it 10 years ago? Was it the Enlightenment itself? Was it Christianity? Was it the Eleusinian mysteries or the destruction thereof? Like how far back is this, slippery slope? Like where's the top of that greased hill? And at what point is it a fallacy and not an actual causal slide? And that's where I think the conversation gets interesting and more valuable and more edifying than in the sort of Gnostic world.
Well, yeah, and that's an interesting perspective too, because I probably lost a lot of followers because I kind of went hard on Anons. Around after Charlottesville, in 2019 and on, but there was a reason why, and the reason why was because I knew, because I'd been involved with the alt-right and I had been involved with white nationalists, and I had known guys that literally were writing under 3 or 4 names.
Right. And
they were being paid by 3 or 4 different magazines. They were writing under several names, having arguments with themselves, like basically steel manning, like other positions, and having arguments with themselves in different characters. But I know what their real views were and what positions they were trying to advance. And so when I see all these Anons moving forward, and you're dropping words that I know, like in references that I know, vril became very popular. I mean, like I first heard that from the Wolves, and that's because it's a reference to like secret Aryan power. All this stuff that people started repeating, and I'm like, I don't know who these people are, but I don't trust them, and I don't think they're being honest, because obviously they're hiding who they are. And now regular Anons, and I think that turned off a lot of regular Anons, but I don't have a thing against regular guys who just don't want to share their name on the internet because they don't want to lose their job. I mean, it makes sense, But when you're becoming a thought leader, and like no one knows who you really are, and like, what do you actually believe, and like, what position are you actually advancing? We don't really know. I mean, everyone, like, has a persona. You don't really know anybody. Just because you can see my face doesn't mean you like know me. But at the same time, I mean, you have the problem of consistency, uh, legal responsibility. You have, this online record. If I change my position, I have to say why. You have all this responsibility that you have to deal with being a public figure, and they just were kind of skirting all that to just say racy shit and get attention. And so,
Right.
and that is actually the real one of the issues. I mean, all those guys have been unmasked at this point. All these guys have been doxxed, but the guys I was thinking of, basically. But there is an ability of guys like that to manipulate people and create, like this thing that we were talking about, the gnostic anti-Semitism thing. We could just call it gnostic anti-Semitism. But this gnostic, like, anti-Semitism, like, movement, there's guys who can push that really well because they're doing the strategy that you mentioned, that the race strategy,
Right.
very well. And like, this is what they took away from us, like, in all this coded language. I mean, that is a possibility. Do I see groups of men coming out in public and doing that on campuses in the way that you had woke stuff happening, and that infiltrating the institutions in the way that woke stuff was happening? That stuff took a long time. Like, that wasn't like a movement of the same caliber, because all that Marxism in academia that led to woke being acceptable in the way that it was, I mean, that's 40, 50 years.
Yeah. Well,
Like,
and on that point, Carl Benjamin put out an excellent video today which Dustin Lindsay shared with the group. But Carl was comparing the moment we have now to Emperor Justin the Apostate. Julian the Apostate? I'm sorry. I'm mixing Julian and Dustin. Julian the Apostate, who was an emperor who attempted to undo the Christianization of Rome. And he was very clever about it. He went about it very well, but as Carl Benjamin pointed out, he died in battle. And so none of his policies had the time necessary to take effect and really stick. And so it was immediately undone by his successors, and then Rome became Christian and then split apart and so forth. So the danger and the reason I think it's worth talking about this, and this is not just like spilling the tea about internet drama from the 20 teens or whatever, is that it feels like we are at a pivotal moment in the culture where we have an opportunity to profoundly change the direction that we had been on. And in the same way that people like you and I worry that abortion might turn things leftward if the right tries to make too big of a deal out of it. The same thing goes with the left. If the left makes too big of a deal out of gun ownership and gun regulations, the public will go right, at least in the United States, because that's a profoundly unpopular position, and they overrate their own democratic power on that issue. What the woke right or the gnostic right or the resentful sort of core of these bad parts of the alt,
the resentment right.
Yeah.
It's too complicated of a word. That's what James would say.
I
don't remember it, but yeah.
I feel like gnostic right is close to, it's maybe a little bit too academic, but I don't know. But what it risks doing is like pushing the public back to the left, and through this race war strategy, which is simultaneously, it is effective, but it is also at the same time profoundly distasteful, and it pushes people like you and I away. And it's like, I try to be pretty open-minded. I will have debates with flat earthers. I will have debates with people about the Holocaust and stuff. I got into it with one flat earther guy about the Coriolis effect for a while. It was a fun conversation, but like when you're trying to have a debate with someone and you're trying to advance arguments and they're trying to emotionally push your buttons, you fucking hate that person. You're like, I don't want to have anything to do with you or anyone like you ever again. And if that ressentiment right, because we are not appealing to millions of people, but just hundreds. We can use fancy French Nietzschean terminology for now. If the ressentiment right does make a cultural push, then they risk throwing away the opportunity that we have to do something that moves us towards civic freedom, in line with the newsletter you put out earlier today about freedom versus virtue at the level of civic organization.
Yeah.
Because actually, maybe it's worth bringing that framing up here, because when I first read it and it was like freedom or virtue, I'm like, oh, obviously virtue. Obviously, like, what's the point of freedom without virtue? And then, like, when you think about it in legal civic terms, though, as soon as you put someone who thinks they have possession of the truth about virtue, you're in deep shit. You're in trouble.
Yes.
You are in serious trouble. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I was getting at today. I mean, like, I guess we didn't hit on that yet because we were busy talking about the Jewish stuff. But
that's the danger. That's the problem. It comes up and you miss out on the good stuff.
Yeah. Exactly. It becomes tedious. But we have a commenter in here because I like that I can see these comments are coming through from X now that we're doing that. He said that we should flip the mean. I mean, just put that's how they should do it for the right, but with like parentheses around it.
The right.
But
the echo right.
Let me see. I'll actually just read his comment because it just popped up, but I was between thoughts. So
okay.
He said, I think the issue with the debate is, in part, that you must first accept the premise that a loosely connected group of people can operate as a hive mind with a singular purpose without coordination. If I don't believe that to be even possible, then why would I accept a debate predicated on it? And yeah, that's. I think that's accurate. I mean, I mean, the conspiracies
and you will
exist,
have in response to that. You will have people bring up Kevin McDonald. And
yes. He was mentioned in the comments actually, or someone brought up the culture critique.
And Kevin McDonald is not the sort of person who's going to be doing emotional manipulation plays in place of debate. He is a serious scholar, and like he's someone you could have a meaningful debate with, and who you should take seriously. What conclusions you come to from his research is something for you to go through on your own. But the point I would make in bringing up Kevin McDonald is that there are arguments that people make for that. But the great thing about bringing that up is that once you destroy the sort of emotional manipulation points, you're in the domain of debate and argument. And I would say that's a win. If you can move from the place of propaganda and just mutual gaslighting and brainwashing into a place where you're exchanging like arguments,
right,
you're in a good place. So that's my opinion anyways.
Yeah, I guess the other side of this, and I don't want to go crazy long on this, but the other side, which you brought up because I was talking about in the essay today, was there's also the theocrats. And I don't think of them as being woke. That's not. I mean, yes, they think that they have a truth that the rest of us don't know, but that's true of every religion on earth.
There's also some overlap.
That is what it is.
There's also some overlap.
Yeah. But in what way? What overlap are you talking about?
I mean, a lot of the hard Christian theocrats are also anti-Semites. In addition,
well, yes, there is that, and so we'll put that aside. But I think that I've seen a danger in people who really aren't that deep into that side of it, or maybe even be super pro-Israel or whatever, but they believe that they will take this as a mandate to create a more Christian nationalist viewpoint, and that is also a dangerous place because that will also push away all the people who actually voted for this to happen and wanted to be healthier and more prosperous and whatever, because they don't want to be ruled by Christians. And I sure as hell don't. And because, yeah, these guys think that they have the solution to the problem. They own virtue as an objective thing. And we won't even get into this because we can then go in a philosophical tunnel for like an hour. But like as we've discussed personally and whatever, they think that they own objective morality, and yes. But which is all actually interpreted subjectively. But they think that they have objective morality. They have a lock on that, and so whatever they actually advance is by its very nature right and good for everyone.
Yes,
and so that's how you end up, and that's what really that's the is that a golem or that's the boogeyman of the Generation X, like left people, is that that Christians are going to come and rule us and tell us what to do, and we have to go to church and we have to do all these things, and there are people who want to do that. I've met guys who were like, our time will come and every knee will bend. And they start saying like that they really believe that, and that's where they think they want this to go.
Yeah.
And those guys are also a danger. I don't think they're Gnostic and I don't think they're woke, but those guys are a problem. And they also need to be kept, like they need to like contained.
They've got their own kind of anti-liberal thing. And as with the anti-Semites, you can break them down into more serious and less serious actors. There's a Tom Wolfe who wrote a book about Christian nationalism. There's a very serious guy actually named Crean who wrote a book, and then there's a profoundly unserious, almost certainly a Fed named Adrian Vermeulen, who like worked with Cass Sunstein about infiltrating cults before he decided he rediscovered his Catholicism and jumped in front of the Christian nationalist parade. It's like, you're a freaking Fed. Right. But anyways, but even among the serious people, there is a philosophical belief that, like, if you believe in objective good, that belief in and of itself moves you closer to that good. And it's like, believing in the concept of good doesn't actually tell you anything about what the good is. They try to deploy ontological logic in a sort of Kantian manner to try to deduce what that must be, and God is always a part of that equation because it has to be, and it's motivated reasoning. But it puts you into a more authoritarian system where it brings us back to the Republic and our discussion of the Republic, and that amusing little vignette at the end in the underworld where the man who was virtuous only because he was raised in a philosophical city and had been taught this but never learned philosophy to think through it on his own, wound up making a poor choice afterwards and wound up as a tyrant. And I think these any kind of social system which says we are going to impose virtue instead of creating a system of freedom that allows people to discover and explore and develop virtue in themselves risks that outcome. And this is actually, I think, best told in a Christian novel named A Clockwork Orange by Burgess, which is a story about them trying to force someone to be good, and it doesn't work. And it doesn't work even according to Christian theology. And that, to me, as someone who enjoys Christian theology, I actually find it fun and interesting. And there's some cool stuff going on in relation to Greek heroism. There's also places it departs, but these Christian theocrats are bad theologians. They don't know their own religion very well, and they're trying to take and use something that's supposed to be above politics and use it as a tool for politics that actually demeans the religion itself in a very ugly way.
They like the left. They're bullies looking for like, a way to bully people, and a reason to do it. Like I always say, like, they want to hate you because God hates you, so they don't have to say it themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, that's very much where a lot of these guys are coming from. Like, well, God says this is wrong, so now I can punch you. Is basically their MO on a lot of these things.
Yeah.
But someone said that we should call it glow gnostics. Atlas in the comments said glow gnostics is what we should, the Fed gnostics. But no. So basically, I think to wrap it up, because I think we're at an hour and a half right now. It's not the best term, and I think it confuses the woke left. I will add that I do find it funny that I actually heard woke for the first time on the far right. I heard it in like white nationalists, like Nazi forums. Not that I was like hanging out in those all the time. That sounds very sketchy, but like
you investigate, you look stuff up.
Yeah,
I remember researching Islam.
People used to argue about me that I'd have to like look at. They'd call me names and fucking we'd come up in my goddamn Google, and I'd be like, goddamn, what are these fuckers talking about now? And it was just a horrible shit. They're gross people. The stuff that they make up in their heads is disgusting. Anyway, like I'd look stuff up and be like, it was woke that originally, like the first time I heard it, was understanding that, like about race and about the Jews and all that stuff.
Yeah.
They're like, and I don't know whether they had gotten it from like black nationalists and they're like taking it forward, like at some point. But this is like 2012 kind of time.
To go back to James Lindsay and his sort of history of where Hegelian Marxist theology comes from Hegel and the phenomenology of spirit. Not all of Hegel's disciples were leftists. The so-called new Hegelians, including Marx, were on the left, but the old Hegelians were on the right. And you had versions of Hegelianism that would pop up. You might hear the term cosmotheism if you spelunk through the 2010 section of the right. And who's that right-wing author who wrote the race war fantasy novels? I forget his name.
Which one?
There's there were a few.
The Cascadian ones?
No, there was a famous guy that influenced the federal bomber. I don't know. His name won't come back to me. But I think some of those guys were attached to this idea of cosmotheism. And I first heard cosmotheism around 2013, 2014 or so. And I was like, what is that? And then I looked it up. I'm like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And then 5 years later, I'm listening to, James Lindsay or reading like Hegel, and I'm hearing about the phenomenology of spirit. I'm like, this sounds very familiar. Have I heard this before? And then someone brought cosmotheism back to mind. I'm like, oh, it's just freaking Hegel. It's Hegel blended with like right-wing, like racial supremacism, essentially. And so like this idea of a world of pure spirit where the world of matter is an illusion can exist on the right too. I don't think it's a very prevalent thing. I don't think it completely captures what James Lindsay is trying to describe. And James Lindsay might be trying to group too many unlike things together under one label. You might just have to bite the bullet and tackle each independent thing individually. You can't just group it all together and say everything I don't like is Hitler. As we used to.
I mean, it got to the point where it did feel like, okay, well, you've already identified everyone on the left that's woke, and now you're doing everybody on the right's woke. Like, who is not woke?
Yeah,
like
us
who
good
is really
liberals.
not woke? Like what's the swath? What's the percentage of population that's not woke? So I think it overreaches. I think the term and. And then you could get into he mentioned Evola and obviously the radical traditionalists and things like that. And for them, tradition might be the big thing. like the world of tradition was so much different, and you don't know, and like they go down that path too. But I don't think that even that is at a level of like the religious level of woke, or the religious level of like this anti-Semitism or whatever that we've been talking about. I think that basically the things that you need to watch out for on the right that I think could really derail the good things that are happening right now are these guys who are too used to like throwing Nazi stuff into everything and thinking it's funny.
The postmodern tendency.
Yeah. I mean, they get away with that because they're anon, but like that can't become like the mainstream thing of the right, because it just gives them everything that they want. Like you said, like Curtis Yarvin's inhabit the caricature, like just giving them everything that they want, because, and yeah, you could say we're not serious, but like if you just keep doing it, like, and there are a lot of guys who are serious that cannot let go of World War II and fetishizing Nazi stuff. Like, I mean, I'm seeing it in pro-Trump videos and like montages and schizo reels and all that kind of stuff. It's like, other people don't know, but I know that you're using Leni Riefenstahl's fucking documentary footage. Like, I know what that is, and I can see it, and your dog whistle is not that hidden. Like, why don't you take some new beautiful photography of like healthy people and go that route? But these people are still recycling like Leni Riefenstahl stuff, and so that's why it's that kind of stuff can derail good things. And also obviously the like Christian nationalists can derail good things. They also have the same threat, and obviously the hard anti-Semitism that's separate from criticism of Israel, that can also derail things because people don't really feel that way. Like most people don't want that, and they don't feel that way, but it becomes mainstream enough that it becomes a major portion of right culture. And white nationalism, I mean, obviously, like that doesn't fly. Like especially in the Western United States, it's not going anywhere. Like that's not, so if you bring that into the picture, it's going to fail. And so you have to like, if you really want to stop corruption, fight immigration, make people healthy, get pharma out of our lives in the way that it is. If you want to do those things, you have to like keep these things contained.
Yeah, and when we think about it as a like a political strategy benchmark, like where are we? We've reached a place, I think, in 2023 or 2024, where if you go out on a college campus and you see someone has spray painted a swastika on something, what's your default assumption about who did that?
Oh, that's the left.
Yeah, that's the left. So it took us a while to get there, because that was not the default assumption back in 2005.
Our comment is calling it Nazi-stalgia.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But like, if we reach a place where that is no longer assumed by default to be like just false flag provocateurs from the left, then like we're politically in trouble, because what we're trying to win over is, in terms of the direction of the country, is a sort of civic degree of freedom where we can explore these things, where we can create our own space. And what we have kind of both on the far left and on the far right are people with very kind of autistically concrete notions of how society should be structured. And it will be perfect if everything just does what they're supposed to do, exactly like Plato's Just City. And there's no way for men to own themselves, to be men in that kind of society. And so the possibility of virtue as a possession of the individual is at stake and is under threat, both by the so-called virtue signalers of the left and by the virtue theocrats of the right. So the best path to virtue is not by trying to force it. Yeah, that's kind of my thought, I guess.
No, it
Wasn't
was
a
a good
very
summary thing.
poetic
I mean,
conclusion.
if I have time, I'll clip it out into a reel. But no, that was good. And yeah, I mean, is it virtue if you didn't do it yourself? You know, like is it virtue if you don't, if you didn't make the decision to be virtuous, or
Yeah.
you're just an NPC
And
at that
people
point? Like
talk about, well, it's all about the effects, and the effects of society are good. And you can say, yes, the effects will be good, and you will still want to kill yourself, because I
yeah,
hope that doesn't trigger YouTube, because you will feel like an automaton inside your own body that isn't
right.
with no sense of agency, no sense of will, and no feeling of your power increasing in the world, to return to Nietzsche for a moment.
And there are people that want that because they just want to be told what to do. And there are a lot of people who want
Right.
that, but
Well, can we tell
I
those people
don't.
to stop it? Can we just tell those people to stop it? You want to be told what to do? Just stop it.
Yeah, stop
Just
it.
stop
That thing, stop it. Stop it. Well, really, I think in a big picture, it also that hinders innovation.
Yeah.
That I mean, like, because you need people who are going to experiment and they're going to go outside the box, and that's how you have innovation. If everybody does exactly what they're told, there's no innovation, and it's sterile. Which is, they always say that about the Chinese. Like they don't innovate, but they copy really well. Because that's what their culture has been trained to do. I don't know if that's actually true. I'm not like trying to make stereotypes about Chinese people. I don't know enough about Chinese people to actually do that. But that's one of the things that people has been tossed around. There's a lack of innovation there, and because they get in line. And America is good at innovation because we don't like to be. We don't we don't like that.
Yeah.
So
one of my favorite films from the British duo that does their comedy skits, that they're known for, Shaun of the Dead and what, Hot Fuzz, but maybe an
right.
underrated one is The World's End, where a group of older, like middle-aged men, are trying to relive their teenage years and hit all these pubs. And as they're going through and trying to grab drinks at all these pubs, everything has become like sterile and semi-suburban, and it's not edgy like it used to be. And they realize there's an actual active alien takeover going around, with it's like Attack of the Body Snatchers, so the aliens are replacing humans with these aliens, and they're continuing through on their mission to have a drink at all of these pubs. At the very end, there's only two of them that have survived to the end, and they're facing this giant alien, hive mind that's trying to reason with them about why it would be better if they just go along with the Borg. And they're like, we just don't like being told what to do. Very, 12 beers and a freaking couple fist fights through in the night. And the alien's finally like, fine. It just leaves. And I feel like that's it. That's the spirit, though. That is the spirit.
For sure.
We don't like being told what to do. And no mortal's notion of, if only we could all just X. None of that is compelling enough to give up our own sense of agency and our control over our own fate, and the feeling of control, at least, over our destiny. Even Absolutely. If that means failure.
I mean, even why even bother? I mean, if you're not in control of if you don't have any, that's why we've gotten into this with free will and things like that. Like why bother if everything's already predetermined? Just whatever, fuck it. Yeah, I mean, I always, for years and years, I've said, whenever you start with the statement, if everyone would just ... everything you say after that is wrong. Like basically, like you've just made what you're going to say is wrong, because that's because humans are tribal and they're not going to do that. They just generally. That's why religion's schism. That's why all these things, like, people want to have their own self-determined areas, and if something gets too big, it starts to break up, and that's just what happens. And so you're not going to have if everyone would just is not an argument. It's a really bad. It's a start of foolishness. So I think we should end there.
Yeah.
Just so that we don't go crazy. We're almost hitting 2 hours here. But this was a good one. I knew this would be a little spicy, and we'll probably get some more views on this later.
Yeah.
But but we'll see what happens. But anyway, I'm going to sign off here now. There's going to be a thing that tells you to like and subscribe, but like and subscribe. And if any of you had wanted to read, Christopher has a really long essay in our book, Patera, the Journal of Solar Culture. We have a book that we put out last year. We're working on the next one. I just finished the Kindle of that, and it is now available this week. So anyone who wanted to read it but didn't want to buy a $26 book, they can now just read the Kindle of it. And so that essay is out and available now. So hopefully you can get more readers of that. I have a cool essay in it about Apollo. And we also talk about some things that I think are more relevant now than they were even then, because we're talking about a human future and zoological humanism. And I magically will have a whole thread about that that's already written that's on X tomorrow
Nice.
to promote that. So that's out there. And thank you guys for watching tonight. We got some viewers on X. We got some viewers on YouTube. It's cool to see that happening. So anyway, see you guys later. Stay solar.
Stay solar.
Thank you for watching or listening to the Journal of Solar Culture. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and leave us a comment. The first volume of our journal is available in paperback and now, finally, on Kindle. Pick it up in our store or on Amazon.